Introduction. Understanding meat aging techniques. Aging meat is a process that enhances flavor, texture, and tenderness. Among the most popular methods for aging beef are dry aging and wet aging. Both techniques involve controlled conditions, but they differ in their processes, outcomes, and the unique characteristics they impart to the meat. Understanding the science behind these methods can help consumers appreciate the complexities of aged beef. What is dry aging beef? Dry aging involves hanging beef cuts in a controlled environment where the meat is exposed to air. The beef is stored at specific temperatures and humidity levels, often for weeks. During this time, moisture evaporates from the meat, concentrating its flavor, and enzymes break down muscle fibers, tenderizing the texture. The outer layer of the meat forms a crust, which is later trimmed off before cooking. The process and benefits of dry aging. The dry aging process enhances beef's natural flavors by intensifying the beefy taste and imparting a nutty, earthy aroma. The air exposure allows the meat's enzymes to tenderize it, resulting in a rich, melt-in-the-mouth texture. While dry aging is time-consuming and costly, it produces a distinct flavor profile that is prized by steak enthusiasts and high-end restaurants. What is wet aging beef? In contrast, wet aging involves vacuum sealing beef cuts in plastic bags and storing them in refrigeration. Unlike dry aging, the meat remains in its natural moisture, and the aging occurs without air exposure. The beef is aged for a shorter period, usually from a few days to a few weeks. Wet aging is simpler and more cost-effective compared to dry aging, but it still results in a tender and flavorful product. The process and benefits of wet aging. Wet aging allows enzymes to break down muscle fibers, similar to dry aging, but without the moisture loss. This results in a more subtle flavor compared to the intense, concentrated taste of dry-aged beef. Wet-aged meat retains more moisture, which can lead to a juicier steak. The process is less labor-intensive and yields consistent results, making it the more common method in most grocery stores. Differences in flavor between dry-aged and wet-aged beef. The most notable difference between dry-aged and wet-aged beef is their flavor. Dry-aged beef has a more intense, earthy flavor with hints of nuttiness and richness, often described as beefier. In contrast, wet-aged beef maintains a milder, fresher flavor. While wet aging tends to preserve the natural taste of the meat, dry aging allows for a deeper, more complex flavor profile that develops with time. Texture and tenderness. Dry-aged versus wet-aged. Dry-aged beef generally has a firmer texture, which is a result of moisture loss during the aging process. This concentrated texture often appeals to steak lovers who enjoy a chewy, robust cut. Wet-aged beef, on the other hand, retains more moisture and is typically softer and more tender. The tenderness of wet-aged beef makes it more palatable for those who prefer a smoother, melt-in-the-mouth experience. Cost considerations. Dry aging versus wet aging. The cost of aging meat varies greatly between dry aging and wet aging. Dry aging is more expensive due to the time, space, and controlled conditions required for the process. Additionally, the outer crust that is trimmed away reduces the final yield of usable meat. Wet aging is much more affordable, as it requires less time and less specialized equipment. This makes wet-aged beef more widely available and budget-friendly for most consumers. The shelf life of dry-aged versus wet-aged beef. Dry-aged beef has a shorter shelf life due to its exposure to air and the need for precise storage conditions. Typically, dry-aged cuts should be cooked or consumed within a few weeks of being processed. Wet-aged beef, however, can be stored for longer periods in its vacuum-sealed packaging, which helps preserve its freshness and quality. The sealed environment minimizes the risk of bacterial contamination and keeps the meat in optimal condition. Choosing between dry-aged and wet-aged beef. When deciding between dry-aged and wet-aged beef, personal preferences play a significant role. Those seeking a robust, flavorful steak with a chewy texture may prefer dry-aged beef. On the other hand, if tenderness and a mild, fresh flavor are priorities, wet-aged beef may be the better choice. Both methods produce high-quality meat, but the choice depends on the desired culinary experience. Conclusion. The science of aging beef. Both dry aging and wet aging are methods that elevate the quality of beef, but they do so in different ways. Dry aging concentrates flavor and enhances tenderness, creating a richer, more complex eating experience. Wet aging retains moisture and tenderness, making it a more accessible and consistent option for many consumers. Whether you choose dry-aged or wet-aged beef, the aging process is a key factor in creating a delicious, high-quality steak.